Let me tell you something nobody tells you about getting older. Nobody warns you that the people most capable of breaking your heart aren't strangers. They're the ones who ate at your table, slept under your roof, and called you dad. Stay with me, because this story starts with rejection, but I promise you, it ends with something nobody saw coming. Welcome back to Dad's True Revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. I remember the exact moment my life split into two halves. Before Christmas 2016, and after it. I was standing in my kitchen, still in my work boots, holding my phone like it had just bitten me. I'd called Savannah to confirm what time she wanted me over for Christmas dinner. We'd done it every year since her mother passed. Every single year. Turkey, bad holiday movies, her burning the rolls, me pretending I didn't notice. Simple. Ours. She picked up on the third ring, and I could tell immediately something was off. Her voice had that tightness to it, the kind a man learns to recognize after raising a daughter for 26 years. I said, "Hey, sweetheart, just calling about Christmas. You need me to bring anything?" I was thinking I'd grab that pecan pie from Henderson's bakery, the one you used to steal slices of before dinner. Silence, not the comfortable kind. Then she said, "Dad, Mitchell doesn't think it's a good idea this year." I actually laughed, out loud, because I genuinely thought she was joking. I said, "Mitchell doesn't think Christmas is a good idea. You two didn't exactly hit it off at Thanksgiving, and he needs space in his own home." His own home. The home I helped them put a down payment on. But sure, I kept my voice even. I said, "Savannah, I'm not coming to visit Mitchell. I'm coming to see my daughter." She went quiet again. Then, in a voice so small it didn't even sound like her, she said, "Dad, please don't make this harder than it already is." And there it was. She wasn't asking me not to come. She was telling me. And somewhere in the background I could have sworn I heard Mitchell's footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like a man who was listening to make sure the job got done right. I said, "Okay, Savannah." Just that, okay. Because what else do you say when your daughter chooses a man over her father on Christmas? I hung up, stood in that kitchen for probably 4 minutes without moving. Then I looked around at the house. Our house, the one her mother and I built a life in, and I thought, I am not spending Christmas staring at these walls. Now here's where the story takes a turn. Keep listening. I drove to Hargrove's, this little family restaurant about 2 miles from the house. Nothing fancy. The kind of place with paper placemats and a waitress who calls you on, whether you like it or not. It was Christmas Eve. The place was half empty. Soft music playing, some old Nat King Cole. And I sat down at a table for two, which felt unnecessarily cruel, and I ordered the pot roast and a coffee. I was doing fine, I want you to know. I was composed. A dignified 61-year-old man eating pot roast alone on Christmas Eve. Totally fine. Then the waitress brought a bread basket and said, "Just you tonight, sweetheart." And I said, "Just me." She gave me that look. You know the one. That "oh, you poor thing" look that good-hearted people genuinely cannot help giving you. I almost asked for the check right then. But then I heard her. From across the restaurant, a woman's voice, big, warm, completely unself-conscious, said, "Sir, hey sir," in the blue jacket. I looked up. A woman, maybe mid-40s, was waving at me from a table across the room. She had natural hair, bright eyes, and the kind of smile that takes up her whole face. Beside her sat 3 kids, a young man who looked about 19, staring at his phone, a teenage girl with her arms crossed like she'd been personally wronged by Christmas itself, and a little boy, couldn't have been more than 8, who was wearing a paper crown from a Christmas cracker, and absolutely nobody was going to tell him otherwise. She said, "You sitting alone?" I looked behind me, then back at her. I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Well, that's ridiculous. Come sit with us. We've got enough food to feed a small country, and Marcus over here eats like a bird when he's on his phone." The young man, Marcus, looked up just long enough to say, "I eat fine," then went back to his phone. The teenage girl, Ava, looked at me, then looked at her mother and said, "Mom, you cannot just invite strangers to our table." Sandy said, "I just did, baby," and pulled out the empty chair beside her, like the matter was settled. And I don't know why I stood up. I cannot fully explain it to you even now. Maybe I was tired of my own company. Maybe something in me recognized something in her. That particular kind of stubborn warmth that refuses to let the world be cold. I picked up my coffee. I walked over, sat down. I said, Caleb Harmon. She said, Sandra Peace. Sandy. And you look too sad to eat alone on Christmas, no offense. I said, some taken, actually. And Tyler, the little boy with the paper crown, looked at me with complete seriousness and said, do you know any good jokes? I said, a few. He said, are they actually funny or just dad funny? I said, what's the difference? Ava said without looking up, dad jokes make you groan. Actually funny jokes make you laugh. I said, fair enough. Let me think. And just like that, I was no longer a man eating alone on Christmas Eve. I was sitting at a table that had no idea yet that it had just changed my life. By the end of dinner, I knew that Sandy's husband had walked out 14 months ago, that Marcus was trying to get into community college for automotive engineering, that Ava wanted to be a lawyer and argued like she already was one, and that Tyler was missing his 2 front teeth and considered this deeply unfair. Sandy knew that I had a daughter I wouldn't be seeing this Christmas. She didn't push. She just nodded the way people do when they understand that some pain is too fresh to poke at. When the check came, I reached for it. She said, don't you dare. I said, you fed a stranger on Christmas, the least I can do. She said, the least you can do is show up next Saturday. I make gumbo every first Saturday of the month. Tyler already likes you and he doesn't like anybody. Tyler nodded solemnly, confirming. I looked at this woman, this family. This table was full of people who had absolutely no obligation to me whatsoever, and I said, I'll bring dessert. I had no idea that the first Saturday would turn into 7 years. I had no idea that these 4 people would become the truest family I'd ever known. And I had absolutely no idea that one phone call, 7 years later, would rip everything open and finally show me what Mitchell Frost had really been doing to my daughter all along. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor, subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you, genuinely. Let me tell you something about 7 years. 7 years is long enough to forget the shape of loneliness, long enough to stop flinching every time a holiday rolls around, long enough to build something so real, so solid that you almost stop grieving the thing you lost. But here's what 7 years is not long enough to do. It is not long enough to hide a man's true nature forever. And Mitchell Frost was about to find that out the hard way. Those 7 years with Sandy and her kids didn't happen all at once. It was slow, beautiful, the way real things always are. The first Saturday I showed up with a pecan pie from Henderson's Bakery, the same one I used to bring Savannah. Sandy opened the door, looked at the pie, looked at me and said, "You're already my favorite person and you've been here 4 seconds." Tyler grabbed the pie box before I could even step inside. Ava said, "Tyler, that is not yours," then looked at me and said, "It's nice to see you again, Mr. Harmon." Very formal, very lawyer in training. Marcus was under the kitchen sink fixing a leak, which told me everything I needed to know about that young man. I rolled up my sleeves and got under there with him. Sandy leaned in the doorway and said, "You plumbed before?" I said, "Raised a daughter alone for 11 years after my wife passed. I've plumbed, plastered, rewired a bathroom, and once performed emergency surgery on a Barbie dream house." Marcus laughed from under the sink. First time I'd heard him laugh. It sounded like progress. "Now I need you to understand something before I go further, because this next part matters. During all of this, all 7 years of Gumbo Saturdays and Tyler's Little League games and helping Marcus study for his licensing exam, and watching Ava absolutely destroy her mock trial competition, I never stopped thinking about Savannah. Not once. I called her. Regularly. Sometimes she answered, sometimes she didn't. When she did, the conversations were short, careful, like she was choosing every word from a pre-approved list. "I'm fine, Dad. Mitchell's good. Thanks. Work is busy. I'll try to call more." She never did. I sent cards on her birthday, Christmas, Easter. I never knew if she got them. After the 3rd year, I started wondering if she was getting them at all. One afternoon, this was around year 4, I ran into her old college friend, Patrice, at the grocery store. Patrice hugged me like she hadn't seen sunlight in years, then pulled back and said, "Mr. Harmon, how is Savannah doing? I haven't been able to reach her in forever." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I mean I've called, texted, sent messages through her work email. She just went quiet about 2 years ago. I figured maybe I did something wrong, but nobody could tell me what." I stood there in the cereal aisle holding a box of oatmeal. I said, "You're not the first person to tell me that." Patrice looked at me with something I can only describe as worried recognition. She said, "Mr. Harmon, is she okay? Is he okay with her?" And there it was. The question I'd been circling for 4 years but hadn't been brave enough to land on. I didn't have an answer for Patrice. I gave her my number, told her to keep trying, and drove home with a feeling sitting in my chest like wet concrete. Stay with me, because this is where I made a decision that changed everything. I told Sandy that night. We were on her porch after dinner, the way we always ended up, her with her tea, me with my coffee, the kids somewhere inside making too much noise. I told her about Patrice, about the cards, about the short phone calls, and the pre-approved words and the feeling I couldn't shake. Sandy was quiet for a long time, which was unusual for her. Then she said, "Caleb, I'm going to ask you something and I need you to really think before you answer." I said, "Okay." She said, "In all the years since Mitchell told her to cut you off, has Savannah ever once reached out first? Has she ever called you without you calling her first?" I opened my mouth, then closed it. I sat with that question for probably 30 seconds. Then I said, "No." Sandy nodded slowly, set down her tea, said, "That's not a daughter who stopped loving her father. That's a woman who's been told who she's allowed to love." I heard what she said. I just didn't know yet how right she was. Year 5, Marcus got his automotive certification. We threw him a party at Sandy's house. Streamers, cake, the whole production. Tyler made a handmade card that said, "Congrats, Mark, you're the best mechanic in the world, probably." The spelling was creative. The sentiment was perfect. At some point during the party, Marcus pulled me aside into the kitchen. He was 24 now, taller than me by 2 inches, which he never let me forget. He said, "Hey, I want to say something, and I don't want it to be weird." I said, "Then say it before I decide it's weird." He said, "You didn't have to show up for us. You know that, right? You didn't have to keep coming back. You could have just been some guy my mom invited to dinner one time." He paused. "But you stayed. You showed up for every single thing. And I want you to know that matters. You matter. To all of us." I looked at this young man. This kid who'd been under a sink fixing a leak the first day I met him. I said, "Marcus, showing up for you people is the easiest thing I've done in years." He nodded. Then he hugged me. Firm, real, no nonsense. Ava appeared in the doorway, looked at us, and said, "Are you two crying in the kitchen?" Marcus said no. She said, "Both of you are terrible liars," and walked away. I was a little bit crying. Just for the record, then came the phone call. Year 7, February, a Tuesday. I was at Sandy's helping Tyler with a science project. A volcano, because apparently every generation of children is legally required to make a volcano, when my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. I said, "Hello?" A woman's voice. Clinical, careful. She said, "Is this Caleb Harmon?" I said, "It is." She said, "Mr. Harmon, my name is Dr. Carol Reeves. I'm calling from Mercy General Hospital. I'm trying to reach next of kin for a patient named Savannah Frost. You're listed in her original emergency contacts from several years ago." The volcano kit hit the floor. I said, "What happened?" Dr. Reeves said, "Ms. Frost was in a serious car accident earlier today. She's out of surgery, but she's in critical condition. Mr. Harmon, I have to be honest with you. We've been trying to reach her husband, Mitchell Frost, for the past 4 hours." I said, "And?" She paused, then said very carefully, "We haven't been able to locate him." The wet concrete feeling came back, except this time it was filling my whole chest. I said, "I'm on my way." I said, "You don't have to." She said, "Caleb, get your jacket." Ava came downstairs, read the room in approximately 2 seconds, and said, "We're going with him." Marcus appeared from the hallway already in his coat. Tyler looked at all of us and said, "Is somebody hurt?" Sandy kneeled down, looked him in the eye, and said, "Caleb's daughter needs him right now." Tyler looked at me with those big, serious eyes and said, "Then we gotta go, right?" I couldn't speak for a second. I just nodded. We drove to Mercy General. All 5 of us. A man in the family that chose him, driving through a cold February night toward a daughter who had no idea any of us were coming. And somewhere on that highway, Sandy reached over from the passenger seat and said, "Whatever we find when we get there, you are not facing it alone. You hear me?" I heard her. But nothing. Not 7 years of love, not Sandy's words, not any amount of preparation could have readied me for what we were about to find out about Mitchell Frost, and why my daughter's accident may not have been an accident at all. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps if you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this whole thing running. So, thank you for real. Let me tell you something about hospitals at night. They have a particular kind of silence that isn't really silence at all. It's the sound of people holding their breath, nurses moving fast on soft soles, machines beeping and steady in different rhythms, and somewhere down a corridor, always somewhere down a corridor, someone is getting the worst news of their life. That night, I walked into Mercy General, not knowing if I was about to become that someone. Dr. Reeves met us at the third-floor nurses' station. She was a compact woman, mid-50s, with tired eyes that had clearly seen too much but still hadn't gone cold. She looked at me, then looked at Sandy and the kids behind me, and I could tell she was recalibrating. I said, "They're family." She didn't question it, just nodded and said, "Mr. Harmon, your daughter is stable. The surgery went well. She has a fractured collarbone, 3 broken ribs, and a significant concussion. She's going to need time, but she's going to recover." I exhaled something I felt like I'd been holding for the entire drive over. Then she said, "Can we speak privately for a moment?" I followed Dr. Reeves to a small consultation room, the kind with chairs that are too soft, and walls that are too bare, and a box of tissues on the table that nobody ever wants to need. She closed the door, sat across from me, folded her hands. She said, "Mr. Harmon, I want to be straightforward with you, because I think you deserve that." I said, "Please." She said, "When your daughter was brought in, the paramedics noted the accident. Rear impact at a moderate speed. Her vehicle was pushed into a guardrail. That's what's on the surface report." She paused. But during her examination, our attending physician noted several things that were inconsistent with this being her first trauma. I said, "Meaning what exactly?" She said, "Meaning there were healed fractures, old ones, a previously broken wrist that was never properly set, scarring along her left shoulder consistent with repeated impact over time." She held my gaze. "Mr. Harmon, we are required by law to file a report when we see a pattern like this." The room got very small. I said, "How long?" She said, "Based on what we're seeing, the bone density around the older fractures, the layering of the scar tissue, we're looking at injuries spanning several years." Several years. I sat in that chair and I did the math I didn't want to do. And the math kept landing on the same answer, the same name, Mitchell Frost. I said, "Where is he?" Her husband. She opened a folder. "Detective Warren from the county sheriff's office has been here twice tonight. Apparently Mitchell Frost was also in an accident this evening. Different location, different circumstances. He is currently in police custody." I stared at her. She said, "I don't have details beyond that. Detective Warren asked to speak with you when you arrived. I need you to stay with me right here, because I know what you're thinking. And yes, it gets heavier before it gets lighter." Detective Warren was a tall man, unhurried, with the kind of face that gave nothing away for free. He shook my hand in the hallway and said, "Mr. Harmon, appreciate you coming down. I know this is a lot." I said, "Tell me what's happening with my daughter's husband." He said, "Mitchell Frost was picked up tonight approximately 40 minutes after your daughter's accident. We'd received a call from a neighbor 3 weeks ago, noise complaint that the responding officer flagged as a potential domestic situation. We'd been watching. Tonight, a witness at the scene of your daughter's accident called it in as, and I'm quoting here, 'not looking right,' said the impact looked deliberate." I said, "Deliberate." He said, "We're still investigating. But I want to be honest with you. Mitchell Frost has been very careful for a very long time. Whatever's been happening inside that house, he made sure it stayed inside that house." I thought about Patrice in the cereal aisle. I haven't been able to reach her in forever. I thought about the short phone calls, the pre-approved words. I thought about 7 years of birthday cards I never knew she received. I said, "He isolated her." Detective Warren looked at me steadily and said, "That's the picture that's forming, yes. I have been angry in my life. I felt real anger, the hot, sharp kind that comes fast. But what I felt standing in that hallway was different. It was slow, cold, the kind of anger that sits down, folds its hands, and decides to be patient." Sandy was waiting right outside the consultation room. She took one look at my face and didn't ask a single question. She just stood next to me, close enough that our shoulders touched. That was enough. They let me see Savannah just after midnight. She was in a room at the end of the hall, smaller than I expected, lit by that particular pale hospital light that makes everyone look fragile. She had a bandage along her collarbone, a monitor clipped to her finger, an IV in her left arm. And she looked small. My daughter, who had her mother's eyes and her grandfather's stubbornness, looked so painfully small in that bed. I pulled the chair close and sat down. I didn't say anything for a while. Just watched her breathe, count the breaths the way I used to when she was a baby, and I'd stand over her crib just making sure the world hadn't taken her while I wasn't looking. Then her eyes opened, slow at first, then focusing, then landing on me. She stared for a long moment like she wasn't sure I was real. Then she said, barely above a whisper, "Dad?" I said, "I'm here." Her face did something complicated, something that moved through about 6 emotions in 4 seconds. Then she said, "How did you—" "Mitchell said you stopped. He told me you stopped calling. That you moved away. There it is." I kept my voice very, very steady. I said, "Savannah, I have called you every month for 7 years. I have sent a card on every birthday, every Christmas. I never stopped, not once." She was quiet. I could see her processing it, wrestling with it. She said, he showed me a message, from your number, saying you were done." I said, "Baby, that was not from me." The monitor beeped. Steady, indifferent. She said, "I thought you gave up on me." And her voice broke on that last word in a way that broke something in me too. I leaned forward, took her hand, carefully around the IV. I said, "I have never given up on you, not for a single day. There is nothing on this earth that could make me give up on you." Tears ran sideways across her face into the pillow. She didn't make a sound, just let them fall. We stayed like that for a long time. But here's the moment, the one this whole story has been building toward. Stay with me. 8. After a while, Savannah turned her head toward the door. Through the small rectangular window, she could see into the hallway. Sandy was out there, sitting in a plastic chair, head tilted toward something Tyler was whispering to her. Marcus was leaning against the wall, arms folded, watching the hallway both ways like he was standing guard. Ava was on her phone, but positioned at the exact angle where she could see my door, watching. Savannah watched them for a moment. Then she said, "Who are they?" I said, "That's Sandy, and her kids, Marcus, Ava, and Tyler." She said, Do you know them well?" I almost smiled. I said, 7 years ago, your father was sitting alone in a restaurant on Christmas Eve. Sandy looked across the room and invited a stranger to her table. I paused. I've had dinner at that table almost every Saturday since. She said, "They came here tonight? For you?" I said Sandy had her keys before I finished the phone call. Tyler asked if we had to go, and when I nodded, he said, "Then we gotta go, right?" He's 15 now, still can't spell congratulations, but he'd walk through fire without being asked. Something soft and devastated at the same time. She said, "Dad, I'm so sorry." I said, "No, I need to say it." Her jaw tightened. "I let him tell me who you were. I let him rewrite you into someone who didn't care, and I didn't fight hard enough to know the truth." She exhaled shakily. "He did it with everyone. Patrice, Aunt Lorraine, my friend Becca from work, one by one until it was just him and me in that house. And I thought that was just what marriage was." I said, "That is not what marriage is." She said, "I know that now." Quiet settled over the room, the good kind for once. Then the door pushed open slightly and a small voice said, Sorry, I made this." Standing in the doorway in his jacket, holding a piece of paper folded into quarters, he looked at Savannah with those big serious eyes and said, "I didn't have good paper, so I used the back of a pamphlet, but I made you a card, because Mr. Harmon says you're his daughter, and Mr. Harmon is basically my grandpa, so that makes you like family, I think, if that's okay." Savannah looked at this 15-year-old boy holding a pamphlet card and her whole face crumpled. She said, "That is very okay." Tyler walked in, placed the card carefully on her bedside table, nodded once like a man completing a business transaction, and walked back out. Savannah laughed, soft and watery and real. The first real laugh I'd heard from her in 7 years. I said, "That's Tyler." She said, "I love him already." I said, "Everyone does. He considers it his right." Mitchell Frost was formally charged 6 weeks later. The investigation uncovered what Detective Warren had suspected: a pattern of control, manipulation, and physical abuse carefully hidden behind a polished front door and a charming public smile. The deliberate nature of the accident was ultimately included in the charges. He had spent 7 years building walls around my daughter, cutting the threads that connected her to anyone who loved her, replacing her history with his version of it. But here's what Mitchell Frost never accounted for. He never accounted for a stranger in a blue jacket who sat down at the wrong table on Christmas Eve and refused to let go. He never accounted for Sandy Pierce, who decides in 30 seconds whether someone has a good soul and is never wrong. He never accounted for Marcus, who stands guard without being asked, Ava, who notices everything, or Tyler, who makes cards out of pamphlets because the gesture matters more than the paper. He built walls. We built a family, and families have a way of finding each other through the rubble. Savannah came to Sandy's house for the first time on a Saturday in April. She stood at the front door with a pecan pie from Henderson's bakery. Sandy opened the door. I looked at the pie. I looked at Savannah. Look at me. Then she pulled my daughter into a hug like she'd been waiting 7 years to do it. Because in a way, she had. Tyler appeared, looked at the pie box and said, "Is that from Henderson's?" Savannah said, "It is." Savannah looked at me with wide eyes. I said, "I told you. He considers it his right." She laughed again. That real laugh. And somewhere between that laugh and the smell of Sandy's gumbo coming through the front door, and Marcus setting an extra chair at the table without anyone asking him to, my life, which had cracked clean in two on a Christmas Eve 7 years ago, quietly, finally became whole. If you liked this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of this sphere.